great pleasure for me to speak to you all today about my research on the cosmological argument for the existence of God. Okay, so let me begin by giving a brief introduction about the historical background of the cosmological argument. So as you all may know, the argument has been defended by many philosophers throughout history, including the ancient Greek philosophers such as Plato, Aristotle, and the early Christian philosopher John Peloponnesus, and during the Middle Ages by the Islamic theologian Al-Ghazali and Christian theologian Aquinas, and in the early modern era by Leibniz and others. So this argument can be found in the Judaism, Christian, Islamic, and Hindu traditions as an argument of natural theology. Now, there are three main versions of this argument. The Leibnizian version, which is a kind of contingency argument, arguing from contingency to the existence of a necessary being. And the Thomistic version, which tries to show that there is a first cause that sustains things in existence. And then the Kalam version, which is concerned with the beginning of existence. So my version is fundamentally the Kalam because, as you'll see later, it concerns the beginning of existence. However, I also utilize insights from the contingency argument and also the Thomistic version, which focus on the dependence, right, the impossibility of dependence regress. So I also use insights from these two traditions to strengthen the Kalam. And my version has advantages over the Leibnizian and Thomistic versions in that it is able to demonstrate that the first cause has libertarian freedom, and therefore is a personal creator God. I have defended this unique version of the cosmological argument in two of my books. The first one is titled God and Ultimate Origins, and the second is the Theological and Kalām Cosmological Arguments Revisited. Both books are published in the Palgrave Frontiers in Philosophy of Religion series by Springer Nature. And the second book is open access, so you can download it now and read it if you want. And this book has been endorsed by Professor T.J. Mawson, who teaches philosophy of religion here at Oxford. And he says that it's an innovative examination and defense of the cosmological and theological arguments. And this book has also been endorsed by Dr. William Lane Craig, who is one of the foremost defender of the Kalām cosmological argument nowadays. So let me begin with a defense of the causal principle that underlies this argument. So the causal principle states that whatever begins to exist has a cause. And this is based on the understanding that something does not come from nothing, right? So, and therefore, if something does begin to exist, it didn't come from nothing, right? It must have come from something. And that something is the cause that brings about its existence. So the term whatever here refers to things, events, states, arrangements, whatsoever. Well, beginning of existence, a beginning to exist, right? This refers to something having a finite temporal extension with boundaries. Okay, so I define beginning of existence in such a way that the argument is compatible on both the static and the dynamic theory of time, right? So, for example, I have a beginning of existence. I begin to exist in 1975. Okay, so you can know how old I am. I didn't exist before that, right? So 1975 is a temporal boundary of my existence, right? So my existence has a finite temporal extension in the earlier than direction. Now, as to the term cause, this is used to refer to a necessary condition. Okay, and the reason is because something does not come from nothing, and so if something begins to exist, then it must have come from something else, and that something else is a necessary condition, right, for the thing to begin, for another thing to begin to exist. Okay, so that's what the causal principle means. Now, this principle has been widely misunderstood, right, by many people, because a lot of people today think that quantum physics violate the causal principle. Now, actually, it's not true. Why? Because quantum fluctuations do have causally necessary conditions, right? The quantum fields are the causally necessary conditions. So the fluctuations do not come from nothing, right? They actually came from something. The quantum field is the pre-existing necessary condition, and it fluctuates, right? So quantum physics do not provide a counterexample to the causal principle. And moreover, there are also viable deterministic interpretations of quantum physics, such as David Bohm's pilot wave model or Everett's many world hypothesis. And so it is unjustified, it's unwarranted to think that quantum physics actually violate the causal principle. And as for radioactive decay of atomic nuclei, these events have necessary conditions too. So for example, the weak nuclear force is something that need to exist, right, in order for the decay to happen. And moreover, we know that these events happen in a way that can be described in the form of statistical regularities. And these regularities indicate that there are something more fundamental, right, that ordered the events in such a way that you follow these regularities. Okay, so quantum physics do not violate the causal principle. On the other hand, we have a number of arguments in support of the causal principle. And here I present to you a modus tollens argument, which is a deductively valid argument of the form that if P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P, right? So this is a deductively valid form of inference, and therefore if the premises are true, then the conclusion will be true as well. Okay, so the argument goes like this. If something, say for example, X begins uncaused, then some other particular things, such as Y, which began or could begin to exist around us, will also begin uncaused. Okay, so premise 1 says that if something begin uncaused, we should also see other things begin uncaused around us. However, that's not the case. Right? We do not see tigers, lions, or a sudden increase of electric field begin uncaused around us and electrocuted us to death, right? And therefore, it is not the case that something begins uncaused. Okay, so I think premise 2 is obviously true, right? It's obviously true that we are still alive right now. We haven't been electrocuted to death yet. And so the key question is, why think that premise 1 is true, right? Why think that if something begins uncaused, then we will expect to see other things begin to exist uncaused around us? Now, there are a few reasons for premise 1. The first reason is that if something X begins uncaused, then what this means is that there will be no cause, which makes it the case that only X rather than Y begin uncaused, right? Because that's what begin uncaused means. And moreover, the properties of X and the properties of Y, which differentiate between X and Y in the concrete world, these differences will only be had by X and Y only when X and Y had already begun to exist. Okay, so before they begin to exist, there's no X and Y that has the properties that differentiate between them. So whatever difference between X and Y will only be had by X and Y when X and Y had already begun to exist. Okay, so what this means is that the difference cannot actually make a difference, right? Before they begin to exist, to determine that only X and not Y that begin to exist uncaused. And so what this means is that there will be no difference that can make a difference, right, between X and Y where beginning to exist uncaused is concerned, given that the circumstances around us is compatible with the beginning of Y, right? So as I said earlier on, Y refer to things which began or could begin to exist around us, right? So it means that our surrounding circumstances does not prevent these things from beginning. And therefore, if X begin uncaused, we should expect to see Y begin uncaused as well, right? So an electric field increasing in strength, these events do happen around us. So for example, if I press a switch, right, the electric field will increase in strength. So in our normal day-to-day life, we know that these events are caused, right? If I don't press the switch, these events will not just begin uncaused. However, if something begin uncaused, if X begin uncaused, then we will expect to see these events such as Y, the increasing of electric field, increase in strength of electric field, would begin uncaused as well, right? So what that means is that our surrounding will be totally chaotic, right? We will see all kinds of events begin uncaused around us, like electric field increasing in strength, tigers begin uncaused, lion begin uncaused, right? And so we will observe a totally chaotic world. But that's obviously not the case, right? And therefore, we can know that it is not the case that something begin uncaused. And so, and therefore, we have already established, right, the causal principle that whatever begins to exist has a cause. And so the modus tollens argument is a sound argument because its premises are true, deduction is valid, and therefore the conclusion is true. Okay, whatever begin to exist is dependent on the cause, right, to make it the way it is. And this modus tollens argument answers the objection by David Hume by showing that the causal relation is not just a customary association of that which happens with that which precedes. Rather, it shows that whatever begins to exist is dependent on the cause to make it the case that it is, say, X rather than Y that begin to exist. Okay? So the idea of dependence is established by the Modus tollens argument, which I presented. Moreover, the argument also answers the view of Immanuel Kant. Kant thinks that the causal principle only apply to our phenomenal world. It might not apply to the noumenal world. But my Modus tollens argument shows that the causal principle applies to whatever begin to exist, regardless of whether is it in the noumenal world or phenomenal world, right? Because otherwise, if something in the noumenal world begin uncaused, we will also expect to see things in the phenomenal world begin uncaused around us as well, because there will be no control. Right? You'll be a totally chaotic world in our phenomenal world, but that is not the case. Okay, so this is a very powerful argument which address the skepticism of Hume and the concern of Kant, right? And so once this causal principle is established, we can use the causal principle to then deduce that there must be a first cause, and this first cause is a creator God. Okay? So the rest of the argument goes like this. Okay, now once it's established that whatever begins to exist as a cause, then we know that, okay, so for example, I do begin to exist, right? My beginning of existence would therefore have a cause, and okay, so I came from my parents, and my parents came from my grandparents, and my grandparents came from my great-grandparents. Okay, so the question is, and therefore is whether could there be an infinite regress that avoids a first cause, or its members are joined together by a closed loop that avoids a first cause, or the members are not so joined together and the series has a first cause, right? So either the causal series is infinite or it is finite. If it's finite, then either the ends are joined together like a closed loop, or they are not, or the ends are not joined together. If it's not joined together, then there must be a first cause, right? Now there are a number of arguments which can be given to show that it is not infinite regress and it's not a closed loop, and therefore there is a first cause. And one of these arguments utilize the insights from the Thomistic and the Leibnizian tradition, which I mentioned earlier on. And this is the argument which I called the argument from the viciousness of dependence regress. Okay? And this argument is based on the causal principle that whatever begins to exist depends on the cause. Okay, so the argument goes like this. Let me explain it using an analogy. Right, suppose you see on the screen that there is a series of train cars, and that these train cars these train cars are initially stationary, right? So they are not moving initially. Now, in order for the last train car to begin to move, it has to depend on the one before it to begin to move first, in order that the last train car can begin to move. But the problem is that in order for the one before it to begin to move, it has to depend on the one before it to begin to move first, in order that it can begin to move. Now, if that is all there is, then obviously no train car would ever begin to move, right? Because everyone is dependent on the one before it, but no one has the capacity to begin movement, right? So in order for there to be movement, what is required is that there must be a first puller engine, right? Which is relatively independent in the sense that it doesn't need to depend on another train car to pull it. So such a train engine is required. Such a first puller is required in order that the train cars will begin to move. So likewise, before I begin to exist, my parents have to begin to exist first. And before they begin to exist, their parents have to begin to exist first. Now, if that is all there is, none of us will begin to exist. Why? Because no matter how many prior members there are, none of us will begin to exist. Why? Because every prior member is dependent, right? No prior dependent cause escape from the problem of depending on the prior dependent member in order to begin to exist. So again, what we have here is a vicious regress, right? Just as in the train cars case, everyone will be dependent on the one before, unless there is a first cause, which is independent, which doesn't need to depend on another thing to cause it to exist, but that it is uncaused, right? It can exist independently by itself. So such a first cause must exist in order that other things would exist. Okay? And so this argument established that there must be a first cause. And so the next question is, what is this first cause? Now, since the first cause is the first, it must be uncaused. Okay? And since whatever begins to exist has a cause, this is a causal principle, which we have established earlier on. What this implies is that the first cause must be without beginning. And that is why it can be uncaused, right? And that's why it can exist independently. Now, the next step of the argument says that since a change is an event which has a beginning, by definition, a change is something that happens, right? And something that happens has a beginning of its happening. So a change is defined as as what happens when something gain or lose a property, right? So it is an event that has a beginning. Now, given that this is the case, the beginningless first cause is not a change or event, right? So the first cause cannot be something like a Big Bang, because the Big Bang is something that happens, and the Big Bang has a beginning, right? So the Big Bang happened 13.78 billion years ago, right? So the Big Bang has a beginning, and so the Big Bang cannot be the uncaused first cause, right? Rather, the Big Bang, since the Big Bang has a beginning, something must have caused the Big Bang, right? Something must have caused the bang to happen, right? And so the Big Bang itself cannot be the first cause. Rather, the first cause must be something else, and the first cause must be something that is initially changeless, okay? Because a change is something that has a beginning, right? Since the first cause has no beginning, it must therefore be something that is without change initially. And here, the word initially is used to refer to the first in the series of states ordered causally. Okay, not first in the series of changes or events, right? Because the first cause is not a change, right? So it's not the first in the series of change, right? So the first cause is the first in the series of states ordered causally, right? It's the first of the series of causes. So it is, and in the initial stage, it is without change. So we have established that there must be a first cause that is uncaused, without beginning, and that is initially changeless. So the next question we need to ask is, how does such an initially changeless first cause cause the first effect, cause the first event, cause the first change? Now, the next step of the argument says that in order for the first cause to cause the first change, to cause the first event, regardless of whether the first event is the Big Bang or whatever, the first cause must have two capacities. Firstly, it must have the capacity to bring about the events in such a way that is undetermined by prior events. So the first cause cannot be caused to change by any prior event, right? Why? Because the first cause is the first. Okay. So it must be able to bring about the first event by itself, and moreover, it must also have the capacity to prevent itself from changing. For otherwise, the first cause will not have been initially changeless and existing beginninglessly without the first event. So what this means is that the first cause must be able to hold back its ability to bring about the first event, and yet able to freely bring about the first event by itself. Okay, and so these two capacities jointly they describe what philosophers call libertarian freedom. Okay, which means that the first cause must be something that is free, right? It is a free agent that has this libertarian freedom, and having libertarian also implies that this first cause must be a personal creator, right? It's something personal. Now, to illustrate this point, let me address an objection that some people have raised. Now, some people have asked this question: could the first event be a random event? Okay? And what they mean by random is that it's a spontaneous change of an impersonal cause. Okay, so some people have wondered whether the first cause could be something impersonal and brought about the first event randomly. Okay, spontaneously, right? Spontaneous change. Now, there is a problem with this hypothesis, which is that this hypothesis implies that there is a probability of between 0 to 1, that is a non-zero, non-epistemic probability of the first change arising spontaneously from the initial state of an impersonal entity. So what this implies is that this impersonal entity is unstable, right? It is not stable, and that's why it's able to spontaneously change. And it has this probability of changing, right? It has this disposition of changing. Now, the problem with this hypothesis is that an impersonal entity will not be able to hold back this disposition, because an impersonal entity has no free will, right? It has no free will that will enable it to have a control over itself and to hold back this disposition. So it wouldn't be able to hold back this disposition. And so what this implies is that given that there's a non-zero probability and also a lack of stability, such a first cause, impersonal first cause, would exist in the initial state for only a finite duration, which has a beginning, right? Being a finite duration implies that it has a beginning because it's unstable, right? So it would only exist in that state for a finite duration and then spontaneously change. So it will not have existed in an initially changeless state that is without beginning, right? That wouldn't have been the case. However, I already explained earlier on that the first cause is something that must exist without beginning and also changelessly initially. And therefore, what this implies is that the impersonal unstable entity cannot in fact be the first cause, right? And so this hypothesis doesn't work. Now, on the other hand, if the first cause exists beginninglessly and changelessly and is a personal and is impersonal, then it will be unlimitedly stable, right? That is, if the first cause is not a person and it is initially changeless and it has no beginning, then it will just remain in that state forever, right? Without doing anything, right? It will be forever stable, since the lack of a beginning implies a lack of the limits to its stability. Okay? So in that case, there will be no likelihood or probability of spontaneous change. In other words, the probability of first event arising spontaneously will be zero, which means that it wouldn't have happened, right? So if that's the case, the first cause cannot be the first cause of the first event, right, that eventually brought about the Big Bang and brought about the universe and brought about our existence eventually, right? So this entity would not be the first cause of our existence. And so in summary, the first cause of the first event cannot be an impersonal entity, because otherwise it will be eternally stable or not stable. Now, if it's unstable, then it would not have been in an initially changeless state without beginning. However, if it is a stable impersonal entity, then it will have remained changeless forever without any event happening. Okay, so either way, it doesn't work, right? And therefore, the first cause cannot be impersonal. So what this implies is that the first cause must be a personal entity with libertarian freedom, such that it has the ability to hold back from bringing about the first event and also be able to freely bring about the first event, right? So what this shows is that the first cause is a personal agent, which implies that it's a personal creator of the universe. Okay, so once we understand the cosmological arguments, we can answer a lot of objections, right? So one of the objections was raised by Stephen Hawking, who claimed to have come up with a cosmological model that avoids a creator God. And so, according to his no boundary proposal, real time has a beginning, but he used the concept of imaginary time to postulate a timeless initial state of the universe as a first cause. Okay, so since the initial state of the universe is timeless and no beginning, therefore it doesn't require a cause, right? It always is. Okay, so that is Hawking's no boundary proposal. Now, there are a few problems with Hawking's proposal. The first problem is that Hawking's proposal utilizes what is called imaginary time, but this is something that has no concrete meaning, right? So it is just a kind of, we can treat it as a kind of calculation tool, similar to imaginary numbers such as square root of -1, right? So if you ask what is the square root of 4, we know that that's 2. If you ask what is the square root of 9, we know that that's 3. But if you ask what is the square root of -1, there is no concrete answer, right? So this is just an analytical mathematical device, illustrative tool, which does not correspond to any physical reality. Okay, and so Stephen Hawking's model, it cannot actually work, right? It cannot represent any concrete entity that is our universe, right? That eventually brought about other events happening. So that is the first, right? So this is a metaphysical problem, right, with Hawking's proposal. Now the second problem is that Hawking's model failed to answer how the first cause could have caused the first effect. So on his model, the timeless initial physical impersonal state of the universe, right, is the first cause, right, the timeless initial state. So he postulates that initial state as a replacement of God. However, he doesn't answer the question, so how did that state brought about the first event? He didn't answer that question, right? His model doesn't address this question. So as I already explained earlier on, right, in order to answer this question, the first cause must have libertarian freedom, right? As William Lane Craig also stated, only a personal free agent can account for why the first effect is not co-eternal with the first cause. So we know that the first effect is something that has a beginning, right? The first event is something that has a beginning, whereas the first cause is something that has no beginning and also initially changeless, as I already explained. So how could that be the case? Right? Only a free agent, a personal agent, can explain how that could be the case. Okay, so this is an important argument, an important consideration, which Hawking failed to consider, and therefore his model failed. Right? Hawking has failed to rebut the cosmological argument, which shows that, that there must still be a first cause, which is a personal creator. And so, in conclusion, if an argument is deductively valid and the premises are true, the conclusion is true, right? So this follows from basic logic. A deductively argument preserves the truth of the premises. That is what deductively valid means, right? It preserves the truth of the premises. Now, I already explained earlier on the cosmological argument, which I presented, is deductively valid. And I have also explained that the premises are true. In fact, I think that the premises are obviously true, right? They are so plausible, they are obviously true, and they can also be proved to be true. So one of the premises is that whatever began to exist has a cause. Right? I think this is obviously true. I think it's quite obviously true that something does not come from nothing, right? And moreover, this premise can be proved to be true. I have offered a modus tollens argument, right, to prove that this premise is true. And I also think that it is obviously true that the causal series cannot be an infinite regress, right? Because an infinite regress is a vicious regress, right? It doesn't answer anything, it doesn't explain anything, right? Because every step requires an explanation, right? So in the end, nothing is explained. And I have really also given an argument, right, to prove that that's the case, right? And also it cannot be a closed loop as well, right? Because a closed loop will be viciously circular, right? You'll be like saying that, right, train car A depend on train car B depend on train car C depend on train car A. Obviously, that cannot work as well, right? We will still need to have a first engine, right? We still need to have a first cause, first puller. And so I think that the premises are obviously true. And on the basis of this premise, we can then deduce that there must be a first cause with libertarian freedom, which means that it's a creator. And therefore, the conclusion that the creator God exists is true, right? It follows from the premise. And so this is very important because a lot of people today think that we cannot prove that God exists. Why? Because they think that we cannot observe for ourselves, right? We cannot go back in time and observe the Big Bang to see whether it has and it is ultimately caused by God or not. We cannot confirm with our observation. We don't have a God's eye view, and therefore we cannot know whether God exists or not. Now, however, this is a fallacious reasoning. Why? Because we do not need to observe the conclusion directly in order to prove it. Rather, all we need is to have a sound argument, right? An argument which is deductively valid and the premises are true. And that's how we can prove the conclusion. Right? That is enough to prove the conclusion. And the cosmological argument is exactly such an argument. And therefore, we can know that the conclusion is true. We can prove that it's true, right? That we can prove that God exists. And so this implies that, there must be a first cause that is uncaused without beginning and has libertarian freedom. And this is what we mean by a personal creator of the universe. And therefore, a creator of the universe exists. And this creator is what Plato called the maker and father of all things, and whom Augustine called the source of all blessedness. Right? So to know the creator of the universe, to know the source of all blessings is the greatest blessing. Okay, and with that, I end my presentation.
Splendid. Thank you very much for the presentation. Oh no, this echo. It's not good for me. Anyhow, thank you very much for the presentation, Dr. Loke. We really enjoyed it. Perhaps now it's time to open the floor to some questions. I'll start off with a question that might come up, which is, you talk about infinite regresses. Can Are infinite regresses potentially a challenge towards the infinitude of God, or would say that God exists in time this state, and therefore God's existence pre-creation is not infinite?
All right. Now, God doesn't suffer from the problem of infinite regress. Why? Because God is without beginning and initially changeless, right? So God is not a series of change that is an infinite regress of change or events. No, God is not like that. Therefore, he doesn't suffer from the problem of infinite regress. There's no regress, right? He's just existing without beginning and initially changeless. Given that there's no regress of events, infinite regress of events in God, God doesn't suffer from the problem of infinite regress.
Brilliant. Anyone else have questions? Yes, in the back.
Hello. Yeah, thank you. Yes. Hi. Hello.
So my question was, when you say that the first cause cannot be a random event, you seem to me to rely on the claim that
what I'm saying is that the first event cannot be a random event. The first event cannot be random.
Yes, the first event cannot be a random event. Somewhere in there you said, if it was random, then it must happen with some probability, and if there's no agency to suppress that probability, then it would have to happen within a finite period of time, because the probability of going on for infinity with it never happening would be zero, right? I'm wondering if it would be a problem.
No, because the reason is because if there is a if there is a probability that is not zero, then it wouldn't require an infinite time, right? It would have happened within a finite time. That's the reason behind it.
Yeah. So if there's some probability that it will happen, say in any given period of time, and then that period of time is infinity with it never happening, then the chance of that happening is zero, presumably. But some philosophers think that zero probability things can happen. Like you can flip a coin an infinite number of times, and whatever particular combination of heads or tails comes up, that has probability zero, but it just has to be one of them. So would it be a problem for your argument if zero probability things can happen?
Oh no, I think your question is based on a misunderstanding of what I said just now. What I mean is that if it's a random event, then it would have happened in a finite duration. It doesn't require an infinite time. And so if that's the case, then the first cause couldn't have been existing beginninglessly, right? It would have existed in a finite duration with a beginning, rather than beginninglessly. On the other hand, if the first cause is unlimitedly stable, then it wouldn't have changed at all. So, and in that case, it's also disanalogous with your example of throwing a coin infinitely, because throwing a coin infinitely assumes that there are infinite events, right? In an infinite amount of time, there is infinite events, such that eventually you'll get something, right? Even if the probability is zero, you'll get something out of it because there are infinite events happening. But that will not be, that cannot work as an objection to my argument. Why? Because I already established earlier on, there cannot be an infinite regress of events. And the argument for that is based on the viciousness of causal dependence. And therefore, there must be a first cause, which is initially changeless, which means that it is initially eventless, which means that this first cause cannot be a series of events. The first cause cannot be made up of an infinite series of events like throwing coins infinitely, such that eventually it gives off the first event, right? I mean, it cannot work that way. And so, yeah, so your objection is irrelevant. It doesn't work. Yeah.
Hey, thank you.
Did I have questions? Yes. Would you like to come off? Maybe.
Thank you very much for sharing. I wanted to ask, I don't even see but what got you to make the step from believing in a creator God to then believing in the Christian God? Because that's obviously another step. Yeah. What brought you to that? I'm just interested.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for asking. Now, I answered this question in detail in my other book. Okay, so let me share my screen again. I have recently published a book called The Biggest Questions of Existence. And this book is actually a summary of a number of books I've written, both on the cosmological argument and also on the other books on, say, for example, the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection. And in that book, I explain why I think that the God who created the universe is the God of Christianity. Okay, so if you're interested, you can check out this book. It is available on Amazon Kindle. The ebook is only $2.99. Okay, it's endorsed by a professor from Harvard University, Martin Nowak. Now, to very briefly answer your question, the first reason why I think that the God who created the universe is the God of Christianity is that the historical Jesus himself made claims which, in the context of Jewish monotheism, only the creator God should make that kind of claims. So, for example, in Mark chapter 14, verse 62, right, Jesus claimed to be the Danielic son of man, which when we read the book of Daniel, we understand that that is a divine human figure. And that's why the high priest, after he heard Jesus say those things, right, he tore his clothes and he said, blasphemy, right? You have committed blasphemy. Now, in my book, The Origin of Divine Christology, I provided a number of arguments which shows that Jesus must have said something like this, because otherwise the earliest Christians wouldn't have come to the widespread agreement that Jesus is on the creator side of the creator-creature divide. Okay, why? Because the earliest Christians were monotheistic Jews. So for the monotheistic Jews, no, they were not. So, for example, in Romans chapter 1, right, Paul says that only the creator of the universe deserves to be worshipped. According to these ancient Jews, people should not worship animals or other heroes or people like Moses or whatever. They shouldn't worship these people. They should only worship the creator God. But when we read the letters of Paul in 1 Corinthians 8:6, it says that Jesus, he's the one through whom are all things. All things came through him. So he is regarded on the creator side of the creator-creature divide. And we find that this is a widespread view among the earliest Christians, right? So, so the question is, how did the earliest Christians came to this widespread agreement that Jesus was divine? Now, in my book, I argue that if Jesus did not make such claims, the earliest Christians wouldn't have came to that conviction, right? Because they will regard this as a falsification of their beloved teacher, Jesus. And so what this means is that Jesus must have said something like that, like what Mark 14 said that he said, right? That is regarded as blasphemous by unbelieving Jews, but it's regarded, but it was eventually accepted by the earliest Christians because the earliest Christians witnessed that Jesus resurrected from the dead as a divine vindication of his claim. Okay, and so, and I have, in my book, I have explained the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection and argue that such an event is best explained as a miracle that is caused by God. Okay, and therefore we have good reason to think that the creator of the universe has resurrected Jesus as a vindication of his claim, and therefore the God who created the universe has in fact revealed himself in history, right, through the person of Jesus Christ, and to show us that he is the God of Christianity. Now, of course, there's a lot more to be said about this, right? So I don't have time to go through the historical evidence in detail, but perhaps we can do it on another occasion, where I'll explain this argument in fuller form. But if you're interested, you can check out this book where I explain it in greater detail.
Any other questions? Yes, well, I'd like to come up.
Back to the random events. I think I can understand what you mean when we talk about God, let's say within time, and there's this changeless initial state without beginning. God is in time, and if that's what we mean when we talk about God, then I can follow the argument against there being a random event. But if God is timeless, let's say, with other models, and then there's this random event which comes into time, it's hard for me to see the validity of your objections, because couldn't there be a random event, and the reason it's not eternal with God now is because we're talking about God in a timeless sense rather than within time. And do you think there's a meaningful distinction here with the way you articulate your arguments? That's why the random event isn't co-eternal with God, because God wouldn't be in time in this case, but in the first case, which is also a plausible view, God would be in time, and that in that sense is beginnings.
Well, thank you for the question. Now, you will notice that just now in my presentation, I avoided the issue of whether God is in time or not in time, right? Because this is an issue that is a very big issue. We will need to discuss what do we mean by time and how do we define time. And it will take another 1 hour, right, to talk about all this in detail. And I do discuss all these issues in detail in my books, which I mentioned, in my 2 books, which I mentioned earlier on. But to just answer your question very briefly, one reason why I didn't talk about time, whether God is in time or not, is because it doesn't really matter for my argument. All that matters from the premises of my argument is that this first cause must be without beginning and initially changeless. And there are 2 different ways to understand this. One way is to embrace the view of Richard Swinburne, for example. Richard Swinburne at Oxford University. He famously argued that God is without beginning, but in time, right? So God, according to Swinburne, God is not essentially timeless, but rather God is in time. He is in a timeless place before a physical time that has no beginning, prior to bringing about the first event. Okay, and that view is compatible with my argument too, right? Because in that metaphysical phase, there is no events, right? God exists there in time without beginning, and then bring about the first event. So that is compatible with my argument. However, there is another view, which is a view of William Lane Craig. And Craig's view is that God is without time initially. Okay, so that is different from Swinburne's view. So on that view, God will be timeless initially, right? So God exists timelessly initially without the first event. But in that state, it is also without beginning, right? Because without time, there's no beginning. And so in that case, the first God exists with the first event. They are not co-eternal, okay? Because God is initially timeless, he has no beginning, whereas the first event it has a beginning, right? So in that sense, it's also true to say that they are not co-eternal. And so either way, my argument works, right? That the first cause and the first event, they are not always together. They are not co-eternal. And in order for that to be possible, the first cause must have liberty and freedom, as I explained, right? So as according to Craig, when the first cause bring about the first event, God also enters into time, as he relates, right, to the first event. Okay, so that is Craig's view. So as I said earlier on, my cosmological argument doesn't depend on either of these views, right? Both views are fine with the argument, but these are 2 different ways, right, to explain how the first cause can be without beginning. And I think that on the view, my argument still works. Yeah.
Any follow-up questions?
I hope I answered your question. If you have any follow-up questions, you can feel free to ask. Yes.
Any other questions? Archibald?
Hello. I had a question regarding the first part of the Kalām argument, and the fact that if principles are not necessarily logically necessary, so in the form that everything needs to come into reality, and thus I suppose even the first argument that causes have to have causes has to either exist necessarily as a principle that is without cause, or if it comes into existence of having causes. With that, which either side you sit, if principles have to, like the first principle of that, has to exist necessarily, or if it doesn't exist necessarily, then does it not then imply that not everything has to have a cause? For there could have been a time where this wasn't yet in existence because it didn't necessarily exist, and thus a random event could have occurred, or an event that doesn't have a cause occurred to then have other causes. And so, where does it hinge on the fact of the necessity, at least, of the first principle? Thank you.
Well, thank you for your question. Yeah. So your question concerns whether the causal principle is necessary, right? Now, yes, that's right. Yeah. Now, I do think that the causal principle is necessary, but my argument doesn't require proving that, right? So as you see from my premises, none of my premises require proving that the causal principle is necessary. Rather, all that is necessary for my argument to work is to show that it is actual, right? That in the actual world, whatever begins to exist has a cause, because otherwise our actual world will be totally chaotic. But that's not the case. Okay, and so therefore we know that in the actual world, whatever begins to exist will have to depend on a cause, and eventually there must be a first cause. There is uncaused beginners, etc. That has liberty and freedom, and therefore a creator exists, right, in the actual world, right? Now, of course, I also do think that the creator God is necessary as well, right? So I also think that he exists in all possible worlds. But again, my cosmological argument doesn't require demonstrating that conclusion. Rather, demonstrating that there's a creator God, the actual world, is already enough to refute atheism, right? Atheism claims that there's no God in the actual world. So my argument shows that there is a God in the actual world, and so that is already enough to refute atheism. So I will agree with what you say about as a kind of metaphysical postulate, right? That you have to have some kind of necessary principles, necessary being, and I do agree that there are such things. But what I'm trying to say is that my cosmological, in order to prove that there is a God in the actual world, right? In order to refute atheism, I do not require to actually demonstrate these postulates. My cosmological argument will still work, right? Without such postulates.
I suppose a follow-up question to that could be to ask, well, if it's not a necessary principle, then it could be a potential case that only after the world came into existence that the causal principle or this PSR came into being. Therefore, the extent of the PSR or this principle of sufficient reason is only bound to the created order and not prior to creation, which would allow potentially for an uncaused existence or something along those lines. I suppose that might be a concern.
Yeah, so this concern was raised by Richard Carrier, famous infidel atheist, right? He has written a number of articles criticizing the Kalām arguments, and he and myself, we have a written debate. I have pointed out 90 errors in his arguments, actually. So you can check out the online article. I have it's on my academia.edu website. I have a response to Richard Carrier. And so one of the things that you said is actually what he said. You know, he thinks that the causal principle just kicked in after the universe began uncaused, right? But my response is that no, it doesn't work. If in the actual world the universe began uncaused and then the causal principle kicked in, if that were the case, then the causal principle cannot in fact kick in, right, after the universe began to exist. Why? Because if the universe began uncaused, as I said earlier on, there'll be no difference between the beginning of the universe X and Y. The Y can be events around us, where beginning to exist uncaused is concerned, right? Because any difference will only begin to exist when these things have already begun, right? So before they begin to exist, there's nothing that could make a difference, such that only the universe, but not other things, begin uncaused. So if that is the case, we will also expect to see things begin to exist uncaused around us, and so the causal principle wouldn't apply, right? If that is the case, right? And therefore, Carrier's objection doesn't actually work.
Yes, thank you very much for that answer, and also thank you so much for coming on. In line with Oxford tradition, talks normally end or start 5 minutes after the hour and also end 5 minutes before the hour. So in regards to everyone's time and also in regards to your own time if it's getting late in Hong Kong. Thank you so much for coming on, and I hope to see you soon when I'm back in Hong Kong, Andrew. And thank you so much for the talk.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for your questions and interactions.